You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, show about real-world iOS development. Today with you, your host, Alex Bush. And today we have a very special guest, Rody Davis. Hi, Rody.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So, Rody, this episode is sort of on the wings of the last episode, but we talked to Rody even before then. Basically, Rody, Rody studied in Florida College as studying sound engineering, and then worked as a system administrator, and then later as a freelance producer and developer, and these days working as a full stack developer, building cross-platform applications, iOS and Android, and using Flutter specifically. So this is why we have Rody here today to kind of talk about it. Since last episode, we talked about Dropbox announcing that they, drop in their support of C++ cross-platform. Before we talked about React Native and my experience with JavaScript, sharing code with JavaScript. So now we figured, okay, let's talk about Flutter. So Rody, I guess stage is yours, and tell us what Flutter is. Let's start with that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. So one of the biggest things about Flutter as compared to other ones is Flutter is a mobile-first framework. It wasn't ported from the web. It was never meant to have web compatibility. Actually, the whole reason Flutter was made was they took Chrome and they said, let's take out all the web dependencies and see how fast we can make it. And so that was actually the very first prototype version of Flutter. Since then, they were able to do Android and then later iOS.
And a quick side note, Flutter is written in Dart, right? Not JavaScript.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, Flutter is written in Dart. So the very first early version of Dart was actually very similar to JavaScript. It didn't have types. Since then, when Flutter was released, they released Dart 2.0, which is strongly typed. So one of the cool things about Dart is it has two modes. It has ahead of time compiling, where it actually compiles all the code down to machine code. But the other one is just in time compiling, where it actually can allow hot reload. This is while you're coding your application, you can make a change and it just inserts the code while instead of having to do a full rebuild. Now, since then, Xcode has come out with previews on Swift UI. So it's kind of very similar, except for the fact that it's actually running your application. When you do a hot reload in Flutter, it actually maintains your app state. So if you're 10 screens down, you don't have to go back down. You're just still on that same screen. You make a change and it just updates. Mm-hmm. So it's really powerful for development. And speaking of that, development tools for Flutter have been just simply awesome. Google is really good at developer first focused stuff. So and another side note real quick about the Flutter stuff specifically is for me and our application at our company, we've been able to support all the way down to iOS 8 and Android KitKat. So with the same UI, which has been super awesome.
So, okay, let's quickly take a step back. So sort of just to reiterate, two big parts of the whole Flutter ecosystem is, again, Dart, right? Is the objective-oriented, general purpose language. Mm-hmm. With type system and optional dynamism, or other way around, dynamism, optional type safety. Exactly. And then there's Flutter, which utilizes the language, and Flutter itself is a framework, or what is it, a virtual machine?
Yeah. It's a framework. So it you actually ship it with your application. So what's nice is you can even add Flutter to an existing app as well. So you can actually, for iOS, when you create a Flutter project, it will do iOS as a framework. And then on Android, it'll be a module of Flutter as well. As long as it connects it correctly, you're able to get access to all the stuff. Mm-hmm. So the difference between React Native and Flutter is React Native uses a web view. Flutter uses a UI view. So on Flutter, you're actually painting all the pixels to the screen. So instead of just rendering objects over a virtual JVM, on Flutter, you're literally painting everything inside that canvas. Mm-hmm. So you could actually have an existing iOS application and just have one section of your screen or just an entire screen that's Flutter.
Okay, yeah. So we'll get to that, how it renders it. So, but essentially, the way to use it, right? You
Mhm.
either, as you mentioned, you either can have one portion of your app, maybe one screen. Can it be just one view, even hypothetically,
Yes,
right?
it's just a UI view.
Basically, yeah. Initialize your. Again, maybe you could clarify how technically it happens, but you initialize your Flutter quote unquote
Mhm.
component, and then it spits back out a view canvas that is going to draw on, and then you insert that into your view hierarchy.
Yes, and the UI views in Flutter communicate with Dart over what are called platform channels,
Hmm.
and so it's basically JSON that it goes back and forth. So you can,
Okay.
for example, if you have a Bluetooth plugin, it will stream the Bluetooth events over to Dart, but then you can also stream events back to the native platform. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of plugins in Flutter where we're starting to do things like platform inputs, where you can take an iOS text field and then get access to them from the Dart side as well.
I see. I see. But typically, just to finish with how it all kind of
Hmm.
initialized and how you work with it from the
Yeah.
outside on the higher level perspective. In general, though, you would have one Flutter produce one big container view that takes over your entire app, and that
Yes.
effectively overlays quote unquote everything and becomes your app that Flutter code drives.
Correct. Hmm.
Okay. That makes sense. And so, yeah, how does it draw it? So you mentioned that
Yeah.
unlike React, which is basically sort of transpiling that tree virtual DOM tree
Hmm.
into UI view stuff or something like that,
Yes.
right? How does Flutter? You said it draws it. So does it mean the rebuilds, re-implements all the UI components we have, or how does it work?
Yes. Actually, in fact, they took every single Cupertino widget and have rebuilt it in Flutter, which is awesome. So you can make an app look exactly like iOS. But the really powerful part about Flutter is you can take on any branding or theming that you want. You can make it look like Material Design. You can make it look like iOS. You can make it look like completely custom. And because Flutter was built with UI and animations first, you always have 60 frames a second. So, like I said, where Flutter came from, they took Chrome, the rendering engine called Skia, and that's actually where they get the painting library from. So all like they have all the code that they use on Chrome to parse HTML and JavaScript to create websites. They use that same I think it's written in C++ rendering engine to use for Flutter. So it's super high performance and extremely fast. And then so all it does is take a UI view or an Android view and just paints all the pixels coming from Flutter. Flutter has its own tree and can do its own diffing and stuff for changes. But the thing is, since it's compiled down to machine code, it doesn't have to do that when it's running, only when it's debugging.
Hmm. So does it mean that there is typically a delay between iOS and Android releases, and let's say they come up with new UI elements or something, and then Flutter team has to recreate them, copy,
So
roughly speaking?
the really cool part about Flutter is the community has been super awesome. One of the most active communities I've been a part of, and a lot of times community will make the thing before even the Flutter team does, and then just submit a PR, and it'll be pushed out on the next version of Flutter. But you can making widgets is super easy. So if I wanted to make a custom text field, you get access to everything in the framework. Everything down to Skia is written in Dart. So if I wanted to make my own canvas renderer from a Flutter, or if I wanted to make my own custom gesture recognizers, I could do that because it's all written in Dart. And because I ship my own version of Flutter, it really can be as customized as I need it to be.
Hmm. I see. Okay, so so you also mentioned that there is a communication between
Hmm.
layers is in JSON, right? Could
Yes.
you give more details on that, how that process goes?
Yeah. So it's called platform channels. And so it allows Flutter to communicate with the native side. This is only for the backend plugin side, not for UI. So if you're connecting with Bluetooth, for example, you can have the iOS side be in Objective C or Swift. So it'll communicate with that Swift plugin over that JSON platform channels. So very simple types, strings, JSON, maps, or you can have a list of events and you can communicate both ways. It allows you to have all your existing Swift and Objective-C code the same. So you could literally take an application written in Swift, install Flutter on top of it, and then just communicate with all your existing Swift code, and then just basically rebuild your UI in Flutter if you wanted to.
Does it mean that Flutter application, when it needs to do networking, it has to have that bridge between itself and whatever networking an SURL session, right, on iOS? And on Android, it's equivalent.
So the cool part about Google being so big is the fact that Flutter's been internal for like 6 years. And plus Dart has been used on Angular Dart for a long time. So a lot of those kind of core parts of the Flutter are in Dart. And so networking, HTTP, is actually built into Dart itself. So you don't even need a platform channel if you don't want to. So you can, of course, do that if you want to use an SURL session, or you can just use Dart HTTP and do pretty much everything you need to. So it's more like a trying to do everything in Dart if possible in terms of code sharing, and then going out to the native platform when you have to do something specifically. So for example, I built a cross-platform MIDI synthesizer for Flutter. And by doing that, I took my native Android app and my native iOS app, took the MIDI synthesizer out of them, and created a common shared platform channel to where I could say, play MIDI 127. And then for each plugin, it would say, okay, if the note is this, then it runs the native code, and vice versa. So it allowed me to, in Dart, just call play MIDI note. But in the Swift and Android, I'm able to call the native Android libraries and the native Swift packages as well.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So what I wonder is how, kind of from my research, my understanding was that Flutter's design and architectural, if you will, model is similar to React in a sense of re-rendering a tree of your UI tree based on data changes. So you have this unidirectional data flow from like a Redux type of thing, and then you calculate the diff, rather not you, but the framework using an algorithm, and then it just updates the parts that were supposed to change. Is that how it works conceptually, and sort of when you build Flutter apps, that's your mental model?
Yes, exactly. So Flutter has its own tree, but the difference is it's painting everything onto the canvas. So whereas on React Native, you would have a performance delay by going over the JVM and trying to communicate that back to UI elements, for Flutter, it's just rendering whatever it's seeing. In addition to that, Flutter, because it's so new, and because it's so extensible, you can use whatever state management solution you want. If you want to use Redux, there's already Redux packages, and it's built for that. If you want to do something like that's similar to Combine on Swift, so like very streaming kind of approach, which like I'm kind of using more.
Right?
Yep. There's RX Start, there's Flutter Block, there's a lot of paradigms that are already built with those streaming components in mind. So you don't have to just build on top of what Swift and Android have. You can do it all completely in Dart, where it's made to have high performance.
What's the recommended way? Like, what does Google promote? You know how Apple keeps pushing MVC down our throats? Do they do similar thing with reactive rendering or whatever it's called?
So with Flutter, it's an open question right now because there's so many options. They recommend for beginners to use Provider, which is a simple version of a change notifier where you can just call, like, you're telling the UI when to change, and then it'll update all the listeners. There's a very simple one if you want to use something called set state, which I know all iOS components are stateful by default. So where if you just change the field, it'll just update on the UI. But in Flutter, you have to call set state, which causes a rebuild for that specific widget. But then if you're using streams, the next recommended one is block. So it allows you to just react based on changes coming in.
I see. Very interesting. I mean, it's a side note. I used Dart many years ago. Well, 3-4 years ago when it was still web stuff. And it was a best alternative I could find for web development with like Angular. It was pretty great.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
and it changes all the time too.
Right. So. Yeah. And I'm actually now I'm curious because I thought they're very rigid in terms of like, oh no, let's only use React model, and it's
No.
like that's it, then that's the biggest issue. Maybe one of the biggest issues that I have with the React whole thing is the design of it, right?
Yeah.
But if they're open to other sort of solutions, that's great. That's good to know.
In fact, Provider was actually built by the community as well, and they're recommending it. So that's another example where Google is saying, we may not be the best on this, but we're going to promote something in the community that is. So,
right. Makes sense. Okay, so let's get to let's talk about that Dropbox article, right? And
yes.
maybe there are like sort of 4 points that they had there, and maybe we can see if Flutter addresses them or has them at all, things like that.
Okay.
So one of the problems they had was the overhead of custom frameworks and libraries, right?
Yes.
With C++, they had to build a lot of stuff, right? That to share, again, to simplify my understanding, like networking, right? If they wanted to do networking in that shared code base, C++ code base, they had to build all of that and then somehow bridge it with both Android and iOS side.
Mm-hmm.
So how Flutter addresses that?
So one of the biggest things with Flutter is it allows you to use any existing framework. So in fact, you can use Carthage or CocoaPods or straight up modules if you want on iOS. You can very easily just create Flutter for just iOS applications or just Android applications. In fact, when I started, I didn't even use Flutter for Android. I was only using it for iOS because of how much faster I could move. So for example, if you need to use a cryptocurrency or crypto kit that's built with CocoaPods, then all you have to do is go and install that as a CocoaPod inside your framework, and then you have access to it. A good example of this is the plugin system for Flutter. Every plugin in Flutter can not only just share Dart code, it can also do UI code or native platform channels, which is what makes it so powerful. I can bundle, because I've created a lot of packages for Flutter. I send out, it can include its own dependencies with either CocoaPods on iOS or all the Android modules on Android. And when you send out that plugin, it will install everything you need to for that application. Flutter also knows the interdependencies, so if you have version mismatches and whatever. But it allows you to leverage any existing application. So for example, when I created the MIDI synthesizer, I went out to Android, found an Android library that was already built to do MIDI synthesis. I customized it, and then I just installed that inside of the Android application and then published that for Android. And same for iOS. There was a MIDI synthesizer already built in CocoaPods. And so I took that and, just built something on top of it. So you don't have to rebuild the wheel every time you need to do something.
Mm-hmm. One of the big related to that issues that Dropbox mentioned was threading and background processes,
yes.
and sort of coordinate and all of that. It was a challenge with C++. What happens with Flutter?
So a really cool part is Flutter by default is single threaded, and a lot of people think that that's all Dart is. But Dart provides a extremely simple interface on top of isolates, which can manage background processes on both iOS and Android. You can create as many cores as you need to. So, like, let's say I spin up these isolates. It will use as many cores as the phone has available. So, if you have an 8-core phone, it will use all 8-core threads. The only limitation with isolates is they either have to be static functions or types coming in, because isolates have no information about the other isolates around it. So basically, you have to compile the work and then you get the result back and do something with it. You can't have access to other things inside of it. You have to pass everything it needs, basically.
Interesting. So these isolates, it's not a concept of a thread, really. It's
built on top of iOS threading. So well. Yeah, it uses the same network, the Grand Central Dispatch, and it uses.
Yeah, I was about to ask. Mm-hmm.
Yep, and it uses the Android one as well. But the reason why it has to be static is so it has everything it needs to spin it up, and whenever it finishes, you just have to use the result. So if you're going to do the Fibonacci sequence, you just specify the however many numbers to go out to, and then you just get a result back. So primitive types. So
Interesting. So, okay. So you cannot really give it a custom model object to compute stuff.
correct.
You have to give
You can
it
do,
primitives.
yeah, but you can give it a map, which is really powerful. So you can parse JSON on an isolate. So you can give it a map data and get back a custom object.
So, then within the isolate, that function you run, it's still Dart, fully capable
Yes.
Dart. So you can recreate models or whatever structures in there. Okay, I see.
Exactly.
So worst case, you just map
Yes.
to the dictionary thing and then back from that to whatever. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So just JSON.
Interesting. So does it mean that can't really, as you said, they can't talk to each other? Like with let's say you have something RX Swifty type of stuff where you have a stream of data and you want to process it asynchronously and then map one thing into another, then filter, then have some other higher order function, and then subscribe to the whole chain to get the results on, let's say, main thread.
So the isolates are only for doing extremely heavy operations that are like under the hood, that they're like one-off operations. Everything else, you use a streaming API with stream controllers and stuff like that, to where you can do exactly what you said, where you modify the stream and pass it down and react to events. Flutter uses like a big event cycle. So every time you do like a button press, it just keeps computing until that event triggers in the future, and then it just works off the next one. So yeah, Flutter, when you're using streams and stuff, you can depend on anything you need to, and it's exactly what you would think it would be like. It's only isolates where you're doing like math or something that would be a very heavy calculation. That's what you'd use it for.
I see. Makes sense. Okay, let's go to the next big point in Dropbox article. So they had an overhead of custom development environment, meaning, yeah, they had Swift and Objective-C Swift iOS environment, Xcode, all of that stuff, and libraries, and then they had equivalents on Android, and it was all sort of ready there. But then for the C++ core that they shared between them, nothing was there, and they had to build it all and then polish their own tools and create their own tools, and that took a big overhead. It was a big overhead. It took a lot of work.
Yep. So a huge thing, that one of the reasons why I chose Flutter is this thing exactly. So one advantage that it has over React Native is when I'm in in Flutter, for example, I personally love using VS Code, and it has first-party plugins for Flutter. But then when I want to go into Android, and let's say I need a refactor to Android X, then I can open my Flutter project, just the Android folder in Android Studio, have access to all my Java, my Kotlin, all my packages. I can refactor with the built-in IDE tools. Like I can refactor to Android X. I don't have to do, you get access to just like a regular Android app. But then if I want to go to open my Xcode project, I just right click on the iOS folder and can open Xcode. I have access to all my normal things that you would see in an Xcode project. I can create a storyboard. I can create all my plugins, my dependencies. I can, even go down to my actually app delegate, which can be in Swift or Objective-C, and you'll feel right at home because it's an actual Xcode project. So, which is really nice.
Makes sense. Okay. Another thing they talked about was the overhead of addressing differences between platforms, right? And I think they even had like a sort of funny to me example of what is it, picking images or something, image picker, one of those you that initially was similar, but then as platforms developed, it diverged, and that overhead of that kept increasing.
Yes. So one, like I said, I've made a lot of packages for Flutter, and we can use the image picker as an example. But when you want to do things in iOS and Android separately, you would just say, like on Dart, you would say image picker, pick image. And then on Android, it would present the native dialog to pick an image. And on iOS, it would present an iOS dialog to like an actual iOS dialog to pick an image. And then you get that image back from the result. So whenever you're doing custom stuff that you want native features, you would use the native components already. You don't have to rebuild those. If you want to, you can. But otherwise, all the differences are in the plugins themselves. So as a plugin maintainer, I will have to write the Swift and
Right.
Java.
Yeah.
But then when I publish that, the person using my Flutter package only ever has the Dart. Of course, they can, do a pull request of mine, and if they want to make improvements, but all they ever see is just image picker, pick image picker, pick video, or stuff like that. So they don't even have that part in their application that they have to worry about.
But okay, but does it effectively mean if you rely on JavaScript plugin packages like that they mostly become implement a common denominator between two platforms, right? They cannot really diverge too much into how iOS does it or Android, because, well, you need to find that only one place where they overlap.
Yeah, so I try to, like in my applications, I try to make it as abstract as possible. So the only part that's going to be different is going to be the very, very, very last step, which is going to be the calling out to Swift to call it like an iOS delegate for something. And everything else is going to be in Dart for me. So everything like the receiving, the parsing, the networking, all those other layers are going to be inside Dart. So I don't have to write that twice. Mm-hmm. And as far as the UI, that's another area which can differ. But since the release of Dart 2.3, you can do if iOS and do conditional things inside of your UI if you want to show specific things on different platforms. But yeah, it's the biggest thing is going to be on the back end, Swift and Kotlin differences, but it's as shared or as separate and abstract as you want it to be. Of course, someone could put all their completely separate iOS networking on one side and Android networking on the other, but you kind of lose the advantage of having Dart and being able to already have networking and do that all in one place.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. I guess still, right, like in some scenarios, and that's one of those problems with cross-platform solutions like that. I'm just trying to think of something obvious, simple, and that we can talk through. But maybe a lot of iOS apps, they prefer using tabs, but Android apps prefer using the hamburger menu with a slide-in menu, right? Effective function of it is similar to the user. You're picking between quote-unquote menu options within your app, but that's if let's say you were coding that on iOS using Swift, you can do both, and there are libraries to help you, or you just use a UI tab bar from Apple UI Kit. But then the way you structure it's like code is so different. So how does that happen with Flutter?
So it's actually a package I just released on Flutter. It's called Mobile Sidebar, and it does exactly this. It allows you to abstract your navigation because Flutter, everything's a widget. I mean, everything, even your theme is a widget. You create a navigation component where you can just take a list of screens and you specify what type of navigation you want, and then it handles the navigation for you. So if you want a tab bar, you say, type tab bar, and then under the hood, Flutter will create a tab bar and then put the screens for each one as a stack. And then for Android, if you want a top tab bar, you can also do that too. It handles it. So by being able to abstract that kind of stuff, you're able to, in one place, keep your navigation. So instead of nesting everything inside one screen, you can abstract. So you create your settings screen and you pass in setting screen into this tab bar navigation, and then it handles when to call that and where to show it. So it's all about, because everything's a widget, you can do stuff like this. So you can call just setting screen as a parentheses as an object. You can use that anywhere you want to. You can push to it, you can show it, you can render it, and stuff like that. So it's one of those things that like you have to do an example application to see, because then you really you get it. Like I didn't really understand it when I first started, but once you start, it's really addicting because you can just create things so fast, and and the refactoring stuff in Flutter is awesome. So you create a huge UI tree, and you can just click on a widget and refactor out extract the widget, and then you can completely have that as a separate component. So you can. That's actually what Flutter recommends: is you build your application on one screen as big as possible, or as minimal screens as possible, and then you just refactor at the end, and then you can put it in separate folders and stuff like that. So it knows what depends on what, and that's one of my favorite parts.
Very interesting. Yeah. I'll need to play with that specifically.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And you can feel free to check out my GitHub too. I have tons and tons of examples. So, even now with Flutter Web, you can actually run these examples in the browser, which is cool.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we'll add that to show notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last portion of that article, the Dropbox article, was focusing on overhead of training, hiring, and retaining developers, right? So
yes,
basically attracting talent and simply people skillful with C++ in their case, right? And it was a challenge because they would either find people who know C++, which are, I guess, rare maybe, but then they don't know as much about iOS or Android, and then there's that overhead of training them, or other way around. They'll find good iOS engineers and good Android engineers.
Yes.
They only know Kotlin and Java and maybe Swift or Swift and Objective-C. They don't know C++, nor do they want to. That's even more important, actually, bigger problem. And you can't blame them really, because every other job, most of the other jobs, it wouldn't be useful.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually, at our company, we just hired another Flutter engineer, and because Flutter's new, obviously people aren't going to have 3 years of Flutter experience. But we did look for native developers. So I found someone who was an iOS developer, and I have onboarded him, and he's already self-sufficient in creating Flutter applications in a matter of 3 weeks. Because you already know the iOS side, he's familiar with Xcode. The hardest part about mobile is knowing at least one of the platforms. It's really hard to learn mobile coming from web. But if you start with mobile, it's super easy to be like, okay, this is just a different way to write UI. And, it was really easy to talk through, okay, this is what this is in Xcode. This is what this is in Swift. In fact, Flutter has multiple guides for coming from iOS, coming from Android, coming from web, and shows you exactly how to map your knowledge to where to put it.
Okay, interesting. So I have my own question here, or thing to address. Maybe the last one. We're probably on the time mark to wrap up. Since it's a Google product or Google technology, we know how Google loves shutting things down, right?
Yes.
And I kind of thought Dart died, not officially, but virtually, a few years ago, because not like the web spark just fizzled away, and then TypeScript kind of got a bigger muscle there in the community, as far as I understand.
Yes, well, as with any Google product, it's always you tread lightly. But one of the huge advantages is it was open source from the very beginning. So if Google went away tomorrow, it's still community maintained. They even treat community engineers that are submitting PR requests, as well as internal Google requests for PRs, as the same. So even Google engineers have to submit PRs to the main repo to submit changes. So if it went away tomorrow, hopefully the community would step up and still be able to take on all the stuff, which we are doing. I think you would just have not as many people on the salary taking care of issues. But yes, it's definitely a concern. But I think the community has been super strong in being able to, like Alibaba, for example, has switched all their stuff to Flutter, and that's
interesting. They were a big React Native shop, right? If I'm not mistaken.
So they make huge pull requests to Flutter all the time. And there's just been a lot of other huge companies that have jumped on board recently, like Abbey Road Studios, and just a lot of really cool companies. Hamilton, for example, so a lot of other big companies are incentivized to keep Flutter around. So I think that's also, it's like a catch-22. Like you have to have the big companies to keep the big companies. And I think we're starting to see a huge shift of people coming on because they see that it's so fun to work with. And there's so many people that you can find that can work with it, as well as, it's actually just really enjoyable to use.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to play with it. Again, you haven't convinced me per se, but at least I'm curious now because again, that it sounds like it's more different, at least in some regards, than I thought from React Native.
Yes.
Which for me personally, okay, I'll give it a shot.
Nice.
But okay, cool. Well, Rody, thanks for coming in and sharing your experience and kind of giving us this overview and addressing what the problems Dropbox had. Guys, you can reach us out at hello@insideiosdev.com, tweet at us at insideiosdev. And Rody, where people can find you?
So they can find me at my website at rodydavis.com, Twitter at Rody Davis, and on GitHub at Apple Educate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll add all of those links to our show notes. All right. Thank you, Rody.
Absolutely.
See you next time. Bye.
See ya.